So this video is going to be taken with the absolute crap computer camera that I have, given the fact that my phone has a gigantic crack directly through the front-facing camera and also has zero storage. Anyway, I read books by Kurt Vonnegut. I chose him because after reading Slaughterhouse 5, I thought his writing style and just his general story was very interesting. I liked the kind of intricacies he gave to his books, and I wanted to kind of learn more about him, since the way Slaughterhouse 5 was written, it kind of gave a little bit of an introduction into his life while also telling a sort of fictionalized story, which I thought was fascinating. And in the other two books that I read, I felt sort of similar themes of him not talking about himself, but very much telling stories of that he lived. Kurt Vonnegut was born November 11th, 1922 in Indianapolis, Indiana. He actually has quite a bit of a dark and difficult past in his life. He went to Cornell University before being put on academic probation because of low grades and a controversial article he wrote for a school paper. And so then he went and joined the army because it was at the time of World War II happening, and so it was kind of the prospect you went to if you weren't in college. And he worked at a sort of training facility very close to where he used to live, but at this time his mother committed suicide, and then just a few months later he had to go overseas to Europe and fight in the war. He wasn't necessarily a soldier. He was a information scout. He would go in front of the troops and try and spy on enemies and figure out where they were and then report back. And during this he was actually captured and taken as a prisoner of war. He ended up living in a slaughterhouse in Dresden, Germany, and working as a prisoner of war when Dresden was bombed by U.S. troops. Dresden was a civilian town, so he then was in the midst of this chaos, the remains of a civilian town being bombed by the people who were supposedly the good guys. It kind of very much morphed his opinion on war. Throughout all of his books, he talks very negatively about war, about the impact of it, about the cost of it, and the kind of pointlessness of it. All of these kind of dark themes in his life tie together into his writing. Now to record on a different computer with an even worse camera, because apparently the last one cut off and I didn't realize until I was like done editing that part. Now to actually talk about the books I read. Don't mind my mother yelling at my dog. He has to take pills for Lyme disease and he's a bit of a wimp. The first book by Vonnegut I read was Hocus Pocus. It was about a man named Eugene de Ebs-Harkt who taught at a university for really rich kids with learning disabilities. But it was also just about his general life regarding the fact that he was a Vietnam War veteran and how then later in life he ends up in prison, talking about all different parts of that. And it had a very non-linear feel. It would jump between all different times he was thinking about, because it was all written from the point of view as if it was from Harkt after all of this had happened to him, and it's set up in a way that makes it seem as if each writing segment was just scribbled on a piece of paper and they were all those scraps of paper with the writing on it was just put together in a book as if Vonnegut just stumbled upon it rather than actually wrote it. I really liked that kind of style. I found it really interesting how it wasn't very linear. It was very much like Slaughterhouse 5 in that way, that it didn't like the flow the same way the plot was. And I think it had a lot of anti-war sentiments, like which is commonplace for Vonnegut. But it was kind of a new perspective. It had the Vietnam perspective of a different war, and several times throughout the book, Hart talks about how he wished he had served in World War II because it was a war that was honorable, it had a purpose, whereas the Vietnam War he didn't feel had any purpose, which is an interesting perspective, seeing as Vonnegut was in World War II and he didn't really feel like he had much of a purpose in it, especially him. And he looks down on war even from the perspective of that war, which is supposedly even better in his eyes than, say, the Vietnam. And then it also had times of negative towards technology, which was very common of Vonnegut, as he was very much not positively inclined towards industry. His very first book was actually about a group of revolutionaries against industry. The main showing of this was this griot machine, which you could input your information into and it would give you your entire future. It would give you what job you would do and how well you would do and where you'd end up in life. And it kind of represented how technology was kind of turning our lives into predictable, set out standards of what's going to happen. And it also had a lot of things related to stereotypes, what happens to veterans and things. For example, the main character, Hart, puts in his information, and because he's a Vietnam veteran, the majority of the time he ends up alone as a drunkard on the streets or in prison and things, because that's what was commonplace, that's what is known by this machine. It was very interesting to kind of see the way he sort of accidentally wove in all of his opinions into this one piece that wasn't necessarily about any of it. It was a completely different perspective. It was from a different war. The person who fought in a different war, a person who has a different life than him. Yet it kind of has all of the central themes of his life within it. And the second book I read was Timequake, and this was a very different sort of style. Hocus Pocus was very much a fictionalized work. It was told by the perspective of Hart. Vonnegut never really gave his own opinions or thoughts within it, or not physically, whereas Timequake is written from his point of view, and it's not necessarily a narrative, though it has narrative parts, but he talks about how he wrote this story called Timequake, which he refers to as Timequake 1, where the entire world, just one day, set itself back 10 years, and just, so every single person was just back where they were 10 years before, and they had to relive every single thing that happened to them in those 10 years, and they couldn't change anything of it, but they were aware that the reset had happened, but they couldn't change anything they were doing, so they had no free will. They were just on these instructions for these 10 years. And he wrote this book, but he didn't feel there was no purpose to it. There wasn't structured enough to actually be published or be significant in any way. So he kind of wrote around it in Timequake. He sort of tells about this book he wrote separately. A major character in that was going to be Kilgore Trout, which is a fictional character he's used in other books of his, actually, which he does at one point admit that is sort of a fictionalized version of himself. In a ways, Kilgore Trout is this old science fiction writer who is completely unknown by anyone. He's very wild in his writing. It's very strange and doesn't really have major characters or anything or any significant plot, but They seem very random, all of the stories he writes, but they end up having these significant purposes in the end. And Vonnegut, throughout Timequake, admits that Trout is kind of just the way he passes off his short stories that don't have anywhere to go. He just kind of credits them to Trout and moves on. He also kind of walks the line between reality and fiction many times throughout Timequake, because he will go from one point talking about his real life and his experiences, and then the next talk about about conversations he had with Trout and things he experienced with him, when it's just a fictional character he has created himself. He kind of makes this strange sort of novel that's not a narrative, but it's also not fiction. It has a nice weaving together of many elements, and it very much has the themes of anti-war and anti-industry. There's a big thing about with the free will. It's kind of like technology is placing us and forcing us into this kind of standardized living where we don't actually have any choices. And it also talks a lot about mortality, which is probably due to the fact that he wrote it later on in his career when he was an older man, kind of faced with his mortality again. It talks about death in an interesting light where it's not necessarily seen as a negative. It's kind of seen as life is not purposeful a lot of times, but he also does it in a way that's not necessarily pessimistic. He credits those thoughts to Trout, which is not necessarily taking claim to those ideas, more as like a flicker in his mind more than what he really believes. And it's an interesting sort of balance of what is his idea and what is Trout's idea and how those interact. He reveals a lot more information about himself throughout it. He reveals a lot of background, and he does it in a way that's very sudden and moves past it. He writes as his thoughts, not linearly, but in scattered sections with mentions of others. When things remind him of new things, he talks about those for a while. He doesn't really seem to have much of a set out plan of what he wants to talk about. He just kind of writes, and I think it's very interesting. I really like that style. It seems kind of like quick write style, then edited into a novel. I'm glad I chose Vonnegut for my author study. I really enjoy his writing style. I think it's very unique, and it has a sort of dark comedy throughout that is very interesting, because he's talking about these really complex and difficult psychological issues, and then he makes dark jokes and stupid jokes and isn't afraid to use profanity or mention things that others might not. He uses very bluntness a lot. It's very engaging sort of writing. So now that I've filmed this 3 times, because my both computers are very annoying and I've needed to, it's been a lot, but it's done, and I'll go edit this.